Totally.
Record here. Cool. So we are recording. Um, so Evan, I guess if you want to just give yourself a little bit of an introduction, Evan Forcier, he's in my bottom left, but he's the host of the Super Secret Filmcast and a whole bunch of other stuff that I'll let him talk about.
Yeah, sure. So I am a commercial filmmaker from Massachusetts. So I have been full-time freelance for the last, 5+ years at this point, making videos for organizations and clients of various forms, from music videos to colleges and all kinds of stuff. And sort of transitioned in some ways to now a lot of what I do is just working as a cinematographer on bigger productions. But that's only pertinent in that it's sort of the preface, I guess, to why I started a podcast, which is that I was very much sort of a child of the internet. I was homeschooled my whole life, and so a lot of self-directed learning in my background. And so I almost went to Full Sail University in Orlando for graphic design, and decided that I didn't want to spend $100,000. So I decided to teach myself filmmaking. And just sort of bought some cheap stuff and started looking at stuff on the internet. And 6 years later, I guess at this point, like, it's been my full-time gig almost constantly since then, and have gotten to work on some really cool projects with all kinds of clients like ESPN and Facebook and stuff. And so about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago now, I decided that I really wanted to be intentional about helping other people who wanted to accomplish some of what I had to actually accomplish that. And so I had all these various friends around the industry who are very talented people, but who are not content creators because they're busy being really good at what they do. So I decided to sort of originally just start sharing some of what I knew and then facilitating other people getting stuff out there as well. And so that started for me with a YouTube channel and a blog, and then developed into a podcast late last year. And it was funny because the podcast for me wasn't really like a big part of the plan. It was more of a, like, I'm a big podcast nerd myself. And so it seemed like a logical thing to do. And so it started with, like, the first 3 episodes were like me talking to friends of mine in the industry who are like talented people, but aren't anyone you've ever heard of. And then by, I think, episode 7, we had Greg Fraser on, and he had just finished shooting Star Wars Rogue One, and then he connected us to, like, and so then we started doing all these big movie people, and it sort of like spiraled out of control really quickly. And we've gotten to talk to some really cool people now, and sort of continuing to figure out what I want to do with it and how I want to go about it. But I guess in the context of this conversation, all of those various avenues of things I was doing with YouTube and the blog and podcast left me in this position of where, like, I didn't really want to pursue, like, there's a lot of money to be had in, like, manufacturer related sponsorship deals. So if you schlep someone's stuff, they'll give you money to schlep it. And I wanted to be a more, I guess, impartial, neutral party in the middle of that. And my thought was that I really want to be able to tell it like it is, and to be able to, not be beholden to a lot of the higher powers in the industry. And so I'd love to fund it through the people who find it valuable. And so that was part of the decision to create a Patreon. And so it's been, I guess, over a year now that I've been on Patreon, and it's been a slow and steady climb. But it's, for like a side gig on top of my normal work, it's definitely not a bad thing to have going on. And it's a lot less stressful than a lot of other, like, sponsorship deals and other stuff that I've looked into, because it's not like you have this big person with a big check that's like breathing down your neck. It's a bunch of people with small things who, hopefully have some grace for you if you miss a video a week or something. But that's sort of the long ranty version of who I am and what I do.
That's super cool. And okay, so I just got to ask, because I'm pretty sure we're all captivated by whatever this camera setup you've got going on with the panning. That's pretty cool.
It's this is part of the bonus of being super nerdy with all this kind of stuff. So it's a Canon cinema camera sitting on an automated slider, and then I just have it loop a move. And then we've got like cool RGB lights over here that we can change colors on and stuff. The benefits for me is that they're all work toys that also happen to be valuable for this kind of stuff too.
That's awesome. Okay,
Yeah.
so I think you responded in one of the questions I posted in the group a little while ago last week, I think, about audience size and downloads. And like you have a good sized audience for your podcast, but it's not something that's unattainable, I think, for most podcasters. I think it was like in the 3,000-4,000 kind of downloads an episode range.
Yeah, that's definitely where it's been sitting most consistently. I mean, it definitely tends to creep. And it's interesting to me that it tends to creep almost universally. Like all the episodes go up. So people are like listening to the whole thing when they get into it, because it's not like just recent episodes are getting bigger. But it's like as I go back week after week, it'll be like 40, 100, 40, 300, and you just sort of get all that slow creep going on. But yeah, we're in the like 3,000 to 4,000, which is it's not big in terms of podcasts, but in terms of a sort of very niche thing with no like marketing money behind it, it's big based on other people with similar podcasts that I've talked to.
Right. And so what percentage, or let's just say a number, how many patrons do you have on your Patreon account?
That's a great question. I can check exactly right now. I think it's just shy of 200, somewhere between like 160 and 200.
Okay, so it's a pretty
let me
small
check.
group.
Of course, now my internet's going to be slow. Sorry, guys. I think my internet's being weird.
Okay, but that's like, even if we say roughly around 200, that's like just a good reference. So that's under 1% of your total listeners. Am I doing the math right there?
Under 10%.
Under 10%. I'm missing the decimal spot. I was reading somebody else's post earlier today who was saying that you'd be lucky to get 1% on Patreon, which I was like, I don't know if that's true. It seemed like a bit of a trollish comment, but so I was pulling on that then, but a little under 10%. So that's like pretty solid if you can convert that many listeners. And I know we had actually, Evan and I had a conversation like this before. Originally I recorded it, and then once I started doing the Q&As, it was like, oh, this is a way better format. So I didn't release Evan's. So last time we talked, you were mentioning how much income that was bringing in. Are you fine with sharing that information?
Yeah, totally. It's right around $2,000 a month. It's a little above $2,000 a month right now. And that's like the actual take home after everything gets sliced out of it. It's technically like they're processing $2,500 or something, and then they do credit card fees and their little chunk, and I take like $2,200 home every month.
Okay, so everybody's doing like
so not a bad. I mean, it's
on average.
Yeah, that's the like tier that I sort of push everyone towards, because you can sort of stagger it. And so I have $1, $5, $10, $25, and $100.
Oh, oh, there you are.
So this is fascinating. The program has just totally crashed on me twice. That's really weird. Yeah. I'm apologizing because it's probably my computer, but my computer, I don't know. Anyway, what I was saying was that, there's tiers. So I have like $1, $5, $10, $25, and $100 tiers. And you can set different rewards for each tier. And so different people, you can structure that however you want as far as like what you make the dollar values and what the associated rewards are. But that's sort of how I structured mine. Originally, the $10 tier was $15, and I dropped it a few months into $10 just to make it a little more approachable, and to sort of play the quantity over quality game at that point. But yeah, so the average person is definitely, the grand majority of them are at the $10 level.
Okay. How does it look from the low levels versus the high levels? What's the split look like?
As far as like what they're getting for awards, or as far as
just in like the number of people, like do you have one person doing 100 and like 100 people doing, or maybe 50 people doing $1 or $5, one of the low ones or whatever?
Yeah, let me look real quick because I don't know that off the top of my head. I know that the $100 one is usually short term because basically what I put at the $100 one is they can like Skype me every month. And we'll just like do whatever they want. Like I'll either look at their work or like can talk about something or, sort of consulting ish, but really directed by them. So a lot of times the $100 will be like, you'll get 3 people who do it for a month and they drop off and then they kick back up because they can all change their pledges at any time and cancel them at any time. So it's not like an annual commitment or anything. So it definitely fluctuates. The $100 tier tends to be pretty small. If I had to guess, okay, here I got it. It looks like $100 tier currently has 1 person. The $25 tier probably has like 10 people. And then, there's like, it looks like there's about, I don't know, there's some other people. See, Patreon's interface gets a little weird sometimes. It like freaked out when I changed one of the tiers, and so now it doesn't quite have everyone categorized rightly. But I would say that it looks like we have probably like 10 or 20 $1 people, like 10 or $25 people, and then probably like 150 $10 people.
Oh, okay, so and that is because the reward is more enticing at that point. Probably.
Yeah, I mean that's really the core for me. The way that I structured it is it's like the core content all happens right there. So $1 and $5 are sort of like you want to be involved and support and get something, but you aren't really that worried about the rewards. So like $1, you get your name and the credits of YouTube videos that I do, and $5 you get the ability to know podcast guests ahead of times, and then I allow them to leave questions for podcast guests. But then most people who are doing that jump to $10 because at $10 I do like project breakdowns and go over budgets and how we lit stuff and like all kinds of nerdy film related stuff, but most of that content all sits there. And so pretty much it's like either they're just like throwing $1.
No worries. Oh, your mic's turned off, Evan.
Whoopsie, it mutes me when it restarts. So either they're just like throwing some money to be nice, or if they want to get something out of it, they're pretty much at the $10 tier. So that's most of how it breaks down.
I like that how you mentioned at the $10 tier, a lot of it is not podcast related. Like it's your subject matter related, which I think a lot of people that I've had conversations about Patreon with, it's this whole doing extended episodes is the first thing that their mind jumps to, or all this like more podcast stuff. But like really the podcast is for something else already. And so like that's what people are interested in. So I think like that makes a lot of sense to do bonuses that don't really have anything to do with the podcast. It's more, about whatever you're talking to them about and teaching them or entertaining them on. So that's interesting, and it makes sense that is really popular. Did you find...
Well, and that's one of the things that it probably is worth mentioning.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I think I'm lagging here. Let me close this. No, okay, let's see. I don't know if I'm caught up, but I think what I was saying is that one thing worth noting is that it isn't just the podcast that's feeding into Patreon. So the Facebook group that I run and the YouTube channel and, even my Instagram and stuff is all feeding back towards this thing. So it isn't necessarily just that like podcast people getting bonus podcast content. It's really people who are interested in like me and what I'm doing and the content I'm creating are following up on Patreon. And so a lot of those people are podcast fans, but a lot of them are YouTube people, or a lot of them are just filmmakers who maybe don't watch anything else but want to learn something or support it, So I guess that's worth mentioning, just in that it was a natural thing for me, that I wasn't necessarily thinking of Patreon just from like a podcast bonus perspective. So I totally empathize with like, it's tricky figuring out what to make those different tiers to be. And that's why the best podcast related reward that I could think of was like giving them the opportunity to leave questions for podcast guests. Because otherwise it's like awkward. Like I have a friend who does really well on Patreon too, actually, with his podcast, but he does just like unrelated short bonus episodes. So he'll like pick a topic for himself and like talk for 20 minutes. But sometimes it's like you're like talking to your guest and you're like, okay, let's like end the show. And then we're going to like talk again for 20 minutes for Patreon. And it's just like this random, like, do you do that at the beginning or the end? Like, it's hard to keep the flow. It's just weird. Like, I think that doing separate episodes can work for people, but it can also be a big pain in the butt. And it's not necessarily the most valuable thing that you have to offer in that scenario. And I think that's one of the big things to consider with Patreon is like, what can you offer people that they will see as valuable enough to, you know, be willing to put money towards it. And so part of that for me is like one of the nice things about Patreon is that I can talk about I can talk about a lot of what I do in a way that I wouldn't on YouTube or the podcast, because like I'm not really gonna like put a project's budget out on YouTube because that's just like a little weird, you know.
Yeah.
But like within the context of Patreon, it's a safe space where now I can talk about that, and I know that we're all on the same page and like whatever else, and so that is something I can provide that's really valuable that people don't get a lot of other places. And so I think that's part of what causes a lot of people to buy in and stuff. And so anything you can do to create value, whether it's, you know, doing a Google Hangout once a month, which is something I've done, or, you know, whatever it may be, any way of engaging with your audience, but providing with something that they feel is valuable, then increases your odds of them actually coming in on that exponentially.
Okay. And so how do you funnel people towards the Patreon on your podcast? I know a lot of people, it seems to be a bit funny. Like there's almost this acceptance a little bit of having a sponsor and reading an ad, but when it's your own thing that you own, it's like directly to you. I think people can get a little awkward about asking, like basically just asking for money straight from your audience in a way.
Yeah. I don't know. I think there are different people who do it really well. So I would highly recommend like go on to Patreon, look at some of the top podcast Patreons, and then go listen to their podcasts and see how they handle it. But for me, usually it's something that I just throw out at the end of the show. Our format is sort of intro, which is just sort of me talking and covering stuff, whatever else. And that's usually like, I don't know, 2 minutes or 3 minutes. And then we'll go into like an interview. And then after that, we'll come out of the interview and go back into like a 3-minute outro. And so usually I'll put it in the outro. And it's usually like something along the lines of, you know, and if you like the show, check us out on Patreon. It's a way that you can support the show and helps keep it ad-free and everything else. There are different rewards that you get access to. And so I'll quickly like run through that and then be like, you know, whether it's $1 or $20, whatever you do, you can cancel at any time, but it helps support the show and we really appreciate it. And we'll see you guys next week, you know, sort of. But so I just put it out there. I don't know. I think it's not that it's weirder if you make it like you're asking for money, and it's more cool if you make it as if you have a bonus product that they can engage with, I think.
Right.
And so I'm fine with saying like supporting the show and stuff because I think that that gets the point across. But at the end of the day, I'm pushing the value add of like, you get access to this stuff if you already like this thing, not, hey, give me money because my show's really valuable to you, you know? And I think that can make it more awkward if you're trying to make it like, oh, my podcast is worth $10 a month. And they're like, well, I already get it for free.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I definitely think that approaching it as sort of like a value added sale or sort of an upsell at the end of an episode is the best way that I can do it. Yeah. And then other stuff too, like, I mean, and again, this is where sort of the multifaceted promotion of it all goes out. Like I have a pretty big Instagram. You know, I'm not like huge on Instagram, but I guess I have like 7,800 followers. And so the other day I just like did a series of Instagram stories and I was like, here's recent stuff I've done on Patreon. And I picked up like 25 patrons in 24 hours. Just because people sometimes don't know what you're doing, even because it's behind walls and whatever else. And so like one of the big things on my list right now is that I want to do just like a screencast video for my YouTube channel of me just like going through Patreon and showing some of the different stuff that I do. Because people might hear it on the podcast, but then when they actually see it, like you're just creating more alternate ways to like funnel people into interest in this thing. And the crazy thing is that a lot of the times I found that like a lot of people don't actually engage that much with Patreon, but they like throw the subscription on and then don't think about it again. And so it's sort of a bummer for me sometimes because I love like getting really good questions from listeners or whatever, but it is really interesting too to see that like if I post a podcast guest that's coming on and like open it up for questions, I might get 5 questions out of those like 200 people. So a bunch of them like don't even really look at it. And so from a business perspective, it's like if you can get someone in the door, the odds that they'll just leave it rolling are pretty good.
Okay, that's interesting. And I was going to ask about that if you did any kind of open the doors up and gave like a sneak peek of what you were doing with the Patreon account. And it sounds like that's what you did with the story. So that's interesting that you got that kind of that's a pretty solid gain there of 25 new people given the size that your audience was.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to see because it tells you. I mean, it equated to like over an extra $200 a month, which then over the course of the year is like you're talking $2,400 for one day of Instagram posts, assuming that they all actually stick with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so just helping push people towards it and making them aware, I think, can definitely be really helpful.
Yeah. So do you have any tips on like when you got started? Was there anything that you would have done differently if you were to do it again?
I
Or
think
maybe where like the most important things to focus on at the start, maybe like, focusing on one offering or something versus a whole bunch.
Yeah, I think something I've continued to learn is that for me, like keeping it relatively simple for myself is a key thing because it's easy to like put a bunch of stuff on your plate and not get it done. And so like I'm debating whether to just like scrap the $25 a month tier or to rework it into something else, because like for me the struggle with it is that currently $25 a month is like you get access to live stuff, but every time that I want to go do a live thing, I'm like, I just want everyone to see it and ask questions. Like I don't want to bank on like my $25 a month people seeing it, and so I end up making it public and then I feel like I'm doing them a disservice, and like it just ends up being this whole thing. And so I think that that's where like currently the other tiers are really easy for me to access, where it's like putting people's names in the credits, posting a podcast guest beforehand, or doing a Skype call with someone. Like those are all very attainable goals, but like making other content creation goals is sort of hard for me. So to just sort of like leave it that like if you're at this tier, you get all the bonus stuff basically aside from that.
Yeah.
It's simple for me to execute. And I think the other big thing, I don't know. I mean, it's shifted over time where like originally when I started, it was a core group of like 20 people. And so it was a lot more like personal interaction. And at this point, like there's people from all over the world in there. And so it's really cool, but it's a very different thing than it was at the time. And so I think just sort of being willing to like listen to your audience and pivot what you're offering to and be able to engage with them and just making them feel interacted with and taken care of is a big thing. And so like one thing that I started doing recently was sometimes people will message me a question about, it could be anything from like, what camera should I buy to like, how should I handle this? And instead of writing out answers in the messages, I have a DSLR that it's like a typical like Casey Neistat YouTube vlogger setup, and I'll just throw it on my desk and I'll like answer the question to the camera really quick and I'll post it to Patreon, and then everyone can see it and everyone feels like their questions are getting answered, and like it makes it more communal in general than if I just like replied to their message by themselves, and they feel cool that they got a video made about their question. And so like it's actually quicker for me than typing out an answer half the time too, to just like flip a camera on. And so a lot of honestly my whole journey with like education stuff online, whether it's a podcast or whatever, has been like make it as simple as possible for myself or it won't get done. And so part of it was like, I'm just going to spend, $1,800 on this like vlogging setup so that it can sit on my desk and I can flip it on and it'll work and then it's done. And like, I don't have to think about it, or like getting whatever, like getting the Blackmagic box so that I can do live videos or stuff with a real camera, or like paying someone else to edit the podcast, but just like simplifying my process as much as possible so that I can just like sit down, get something done in an hour and put it out is a big deal, because otherwise it's like, oh, I got to like set this stuff up and think about it and like whatever else. And it doesn't happen for me, especially when I'm really busy. Cause, that's another big thing that's been a struggle for me is like, I'll go on stints where I'm gone, I don't know, 20 plus days out of a month just traveling, shooting stuff. And so it can be hard to get content put out. And so it's like making it something that I can quickly and easily do when I'm home is a very big goal of mine. If you're someone who maybe doesn't have the crazy schedule, there's no reason that you have to invest a ton of money into all that kind of stuff. But for me, I just realized that like I wasn't serving them well unless I invested the money. And I felt like the long-term income, even just from Patreon, was enough that it was worth taking some upfront investment into to just sort of make it good and easy, get it built. Because I mean, there's some people who are huge. I mean, you just start thinking about the numbers, and it's like, if you can get 1,000 people at $10 a month, you're talking six figures a year really quickly. And 1,000 people isn't a ton of people, and $10 a month isn't a ton of money. It just requires a little bit of marketing prowess, and getting people to transfer over to that. And that's another big thing that I've been thinking about and sort of figuring out, partnering with some people who are good at marketing, is like, okay, well, if we get, basically, I have 7,800 eyes sitting on Instagram and 4,000 on the podcast and however many everywhere else. And like, I have 200 of them converting to paying people right now. And if I can up that number, like that equates to a lot of money really quickly just by making a more efficient funnel. So figuring out how to do that funnel well and then have the content well done so that they're staying is another big thing, because you definitely, like, there are months that I was really busy and I lost 5 people because I didn't put anything out in 3 weeks, and they were just like, okay, we're not going to put money behind this anymore. So keeping up with it's smart. Building a backlog for yourself is smart, which is something I do with the podcast now too. I try to always be like 4 episodes ahead of where I'm releasing, so that if I can't do anything a week, it still comes out. But yeah, I don't know. I'm just rambling at this point.
No, it's all good though. It's interesting too that it's kind of nice that your content, there's no conflict. I was almost going to ask, like, at some point, if you're looking to grow the Patreon account, does the podcast and YouTube channel, all this stuff, kind of fall by the wayside? But like, obviously that's still the kind of the wide end of the funnel, that where everybody's getting introduced to you, but it's not like having 2 levels of podcast or 2 levels of YouTube videos. Like, they're just different tasks that it doesn't feel like there would be that conflict between them, between you of like needing to produce an A product and a B product. It's just different products entirely.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things too that I try to think about is like, how can I best use the wide ends of the funnel in that context? So like, I've debated, or not debated, I already started that. I started just playing with that, like answering patrons' questions on Patreon. And then I was like, well, there's no reason I can't make these public YouTube videos. And so it's like, now they're hitting my channel and people are seeing questions getting answered. And then maybe they're like, oh, I had a question that I'd be really curious to see, like, I should go get in on Patreon, or I should go check it out. But just creating more crossover too, where it's like finding that balance between, obviously you want them to feel like what they're getting is beneficial, but at the same time, like, most people who ask a question aren't gonna like feel weird that their question got answered publicly, and so it's like, how can I cross over those streams and like asking the Patreon questions in a way that, like, in the podcast, and it depends on the podcast and the interview, but like, I just did one this week and was very clear that we sort of like finished the whole interview, and I was like, okay, well, we just have a few more questions from patrons for you guys, and so just like, and then like name dropping the people who asked the question and just sort of making it very clear to everyone else. It's like, oh, like, this guy gets cool guests, like I might want to get in on that, but making it clear like where that's coming from, so that then when they hear me at the end go, hey, you should check out Patreon, like there's a natural call to action towards that.
Yeah.
So that the podcast is explicitly calling out the benefit to the patrons, and the YouTube channel is explicitly calling out the benefit, so that it's not just its own little bubble that I'm sort of marketing, but that it's actually cross-interacting with all the other public streams as well.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. I also just wanted to mention, before going back to you were talking about the money you'd invested in, camera and all this stuff. I think that's, that can be scary for people who watch this either now or later. And like, wow, well, obviously you're making a lot off the Patreon, or a relatively decent amount. Also, your audience is a film audience, so they inherently care more about the visuals than any of the rest of our audiences probably. And so like that it just doesn't make sense for the average person.
Oh, totally.
But for yours, it actually does. So I just wanted to throw that out there. It's like, you already mentioned it. You don't need to spend the money, but really most people would not need to invest in that.
Yeah. And I think, anything you can do to just sort of like control your scenario and like make stuff look and sound good is beneficial, but even like what you or Tom or anyone has going on here, like that looks good and I'd watch that and I wouldn't complain about it, so for me, some of it is just like, there was a point where I decided, partially, because of the nature of the content, that it didn't make sense for all my vlogs to be on webcams anymore, because I was doing that for a long time, and that was like a lot of my audience was just webcam vlogs and me talking to the computer, and sort of the production value had to naturally grow, I think, for me to maintain credibility in what I was talking about. Otherwise, it was a little like, well, this guy's talking about this idea, but this looks super ghetto. Like, does he really know what he's talking about? But yeah, I mean, you certainly don't have to spend a ton of money on gear. And for what it's worth, I think it's crazy how much good stuff you can get for super cheap at this point. You know, whether it's like Blue Yetis or whatever else, like there's so much gear that you can get that doesn't cost an arm and a leg. But if you're going to look at it as a business, then I think that looking at a smart perspective of like, how do I make smart initial investments that maybe are going to cost me a little bit of money, but like long-term are going to pay off, can be a really good way to look at it, because some of that stuff can be beneficial. So I would definitely say that you don't have to spend a ton of money, but I would also say that, like, you know, depending on your whole life situation, whatever else, like slicing $100 off the front end could be hurting yourself in the long run, you know, and sometimes just being willing to put something behind it to take that next step can be really beneficial.
Yeah, because like at this point, like it's part of your brand, really, how you appear on whatever you're doing, and like that goes for podcasts and your audio quality and everything as well. But if you are getting into video content or whatever it is you're doing, and I guess, you know, this has been a bit weighted towards the video end. There are a lot of Patreon options that wouldn't have to do anything with video. So again, just like as the nature of your audience and everything, that's just something that makes sense.
Right.
So I think that was most of the questions that I had written down for you. So I'm curious to hear what other people are wondering about, and just we can open it up to anybody else who has questions for Evan.
Hit me, people.
Hi, Evan.
Hi.
Thanks so much for sharing all of that. I really appreciate it.
Anytime.
I was just wondering, why did you choose Patreon over doing like a membership site on your website?
Because it was a whole lot less work to set up.
Okay.
And it is something that I've considered periodically. And honestly, I still dabble with the idea of switching off of Patreon, because like so much of what I do on Patreon is like content and video heavy. And like, honestly, Patreon doesn't do a great job of like delivering that stuff, because it's basically like your patrons get access to a glorified Twitter feed of yours or like Facebook feed. And so like I'll do a video, upload it to YouTube as an unlisted video, post it on the feed. And so like it's annoying for some, I think for some people, that like if you subscribe now, you immediately get access to everything that's ever happened at that tier level, which is another cool thing that I talk about like on the podcast, is like, hey, you don't just get stuff going forward, you get access to at this point like 100 hours of videos. But a lot of the times it means like hitting my profile and scrolling like forever, because there's no like search function for those posts, and there's no way for me to like categorize them together or anything. So you can put like metadata categories on them, and then people can like go to basically a word cloud and like click a category, but it's a little clunky still, in my opinion. So yeah, I've considered it, but a lot of it is like developing a site like that takes time and money. And for me, when I started it, it was just like a crazy idea and not really like a big business venture. And so at this point, it is a consideration that like, okay, we have a big enough audience. Like, is it worth it for me to, you know, put time and money down and then do a big push and try and, you know, get 1,000 people over to a membership site? But for me right now, I just don't think it's worth the time and money, unfortunately, even just to like get it all set up, because you probably could, and then you could like push for higher memberships and whatever, but it's just a whole other ball of wax. Whereas like Patreon's really quick and easy to be like, you put your info in, you can share it with people, they handle all the payment stuff and everything, and like it requires very little maintenance for me, as opposed to if it was my own thing. Okay, so is there like a group sort of discussion area then within that? So yeah, so they have, and that's another sort of interesting thing. So there's like the feed, and everyone can comment on the feed. And then there's like, people can technically basically like write on my wall, but they don't very often. Usually they'll just message me. And so that's another one of the things that I've sort of played with a few times is like how to help build community between patrons, because I think that community can be a really big thing. And that's part of like this Facebook group that I run. We have 2,000 filmmakers from all over the world, and like a whole bunch of that has just been building community. And I've sort of decided at this point that most of the community my patrons are going to find is going to happen in the Facebook group that I have, and it's not going to happen within Patreon because Patreon just doesn't really facilitate it well.
Yeah, and I can understand also, like, if you already have that going on in your Facebook group, that I've looked into the membership site stuff, and it's another whole group to manage and make sure that you're connecting everybody and monitoring, and that's a lot. Can be a lot of drama sometimes.
Totally. I mean, and the Facebook group totally is drama sometimes, and the YouTube channel's drama sometimes, and that's the one catch of the being willing to say stuff that other people in the industry won't say is I've gotten Facebook blocked by a lot of important people for saying stuff they didn't like. But yeah, I mean, just being able to keep on top of that is even an important thing, and so that's part of where like I thankfully have a group of guys who like help moderate the Facebook group, and we made some pretty clearly established rules and stuff. And as that has gotten bigger and bigger, because it started again a few years ago with just a couple people, and now it's enormous, that we've had to increase the scope of the rules and like define things more cleanly, because otherwise it just turns into a mess when you get 2,000 people posting every meme that comes to their head into a Facebook group, and you're like, this is not the point of this. Like, you can do that on your own time. But so yeah, like managing all of that becomes its whole own thing, and then managing the site and technical issues and billing and all that kind of stuff just sounds like a headache sometimes. So I'm currently scattered across like YouTube and Facebook and whatever else, but doing it in a way that just makes it really easy for me. And like the nice thing about Facebook is it's easy for everyone else too, which is something that we've talked about a lot. Is that like thankfully I've heard a lot of really nice things about the group, and we have a lot of big experienced and valuable filmmakers in there, but a lot of what they say is that like this is the perfect place for this to be, because like I wouldn't go to a forum or anything to check this, but it's really easy for me to like check my notifications on Facebook and see if there are any new posts and stuff. So we've had a lot of luck with the ease of engagement with having the Facebook group. And then that's another thing that we can just sort of funnel towards other things now, where we have this big group of people. And there's other stuff that I've done with that, where like we've had manufacturers who we've hooked up basically like group discounts with and stuff, because they decide they want to sell their $500 light, and we can move 400 of them in a day for them. And so they'll give us all 20% off or whatever, which means a lot of free toys for me, because then I usually don't ask for getting paid. I'll just be like, I'll just take one or two of them as a comp for running the deal for you. And so that's another sort of like ecosystem circuitous way that the whole thing works out for me, is that by having the audience and being able to connect manufacturers to the audience, I get gear that then I'm able to use in my day job, which I get paid for to like make commercials and stuff. And so then I'm getting paid rentals for usually expensive equipment that I'm not paying for, because I'm doing this other job of community managing. And then I'm also getting paid for the day job, and then I'm also getting paid on Patreon. So I'm sort of like running this whole convoluted system of trying to provide benefit to a lot of people in a lot of different ways. But it's not a bad gig by the time you do it all.
Well, thanks so much for answering that.
Yeah, no problem.
Sounds like you have an amazing amount of circles going on.
It's a stressful number of circles sometimes, and it's you should ask my wife what it does to my phone habits, because it's not great. But the one thing I will say too, that I don't know if this would be helpful to anyone, but if anyone wants to check out my Patreon just for the heck of it, you're welcome to subscribe, and I can just refund you afterwards if you want. So if you want to just check it out and then message me and be like, hey, that was cool, give me my money back, I can just refund it really easily. But then you can sort of get a peek behind the curtain at it, because it's sort of dumb. They don't give you any good way to like Because I've debated doing like contests and being like, oh, I'll give away like 6 months of Patreon, but they don't have any way to do that. Like you would have to like put money on a prepaid Visa card and then give them that or something. Like there's no way to just like give away Patreon access, but you can refund to people. So if you wanted to check it out and see sort of the mess that it is and then not lose $10, I can do that for you guys.
Cool.
Hey, Evan. First, thanks for your time today. I just had a quick question in regards to front-loading content. Is that something you need to do on Patreon if you're just getting it set up and started?
You mean as far as like having a bank of content when you launch it?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it really depends on like what you're trying to offer. I definitely don't think it's necessary. I can see it being beneficial, just from a like initial marketing perspective. If you were like, and again, it all depends on your show and like how you're structuring it and whatever else. But if you're going to say, hey, we already have this on here that you gain access to, like I can see that being beneficial. But if it's more like community engagement, which for some people it is, that it's like, whatever it is, like I've even played with, and this is another interesting thing maybe for podcast people, is there are different services that you can use to basically funnel your live podcast recording out to people. And so I've played with like, as a patron, you can listen to the podcast as it's recorded instead of like the edited version that hits iTunes. And so like you could do stuff like that, and you could be like, oh, we'll do a Google Hangout once a month or whatever else. And like if it's that kind of thing, then you don't really need pre-existing content because they're just worried about engagement going forward. But if you're trying to sell it as like access to a library of content, then having some content there to begin with could be beneficial. But I wouldn't like wait until you have a big pile of stuff to start promoting it either. But I think it really just comes down to like taking a hard look at who your audience is, what you're giving them and why they care, and then like how you do that, and then how you promote that well, and then the money sort of falls in once all that happens.
Was anybody else at Podcast Movement by chance this year? No? Okay. It was good, but there were some people from Patreon there, and I was talking to one of the girls. I don't know what her role was, but I was asking her about some Patreon stuff and just in general across all types of content creation, not just podcasters, but really anybody doing anything. And she was really saying that the thing that most people found that their audience wanted was the interaction. It wasn't like access to this other content. It was like feeling heard by whoever's running the account. And I know of a few comments you were making earlier, Evan, it sounded like that was really the thing that was working for you as well, was like getting the questions on and getting that kind of shout out on the podcast and that kind of thing. And just the access to you rather than a back catalog of content that was already created.
Yeah. And I think that's something that like, and again, like it's worth looking at other podcasts and stuff who are doing this really well. And I think you can just go look at like the top 10 Patreon, I don't know even what you call it, like Patreon campaigns or whatever, on the site. But if, I think a lot of people, you'll see that a lot of the very big Patreons, like $30,000 a month, are averaging like $3 donations a person, and they get next to nothing out of it, but there's just a ton of them. And so a lot of what it is when you look at big podcasts is it's like you get to listen to the podcast the day before it comes out or something, like it's something a lot of the times really little, or like, oh, we're going to pick 5 people and we're going to like give them a shout out, or, and you can go and look at all those tiers and see what people are doing and what people are engaging with. But a lot of the times it's not this like big upsell. It's like they already appreciate your show and you're giving them some kind of benefit. And if it's like $2, $3, $5, whatever it is, then that can be a big way to transfer people. But I think also pertinent sort of to the other conversation that was being had on the Facebook group was that like if you're a low volume podcast, say you're doing like 100, 200, 500 downloads, then to make that financially sustainable, you might have to think about what you're offering a little different, because you have to offer a higher value to less people. Where it's like, I think the lady said something about like they launched a product and it was like a 6-figure product launch off of a couple hundred people because they like all put in $500 or something. And so, you have to look at that sliding scale of like who your audience is, how many of them there are, and what you can offer them, and try and figure out the sweet spot of like, do I try to offer 10,000 people a $2 shout out, or do I try to offer, 10 of my core listeners, like, whatever it may be, for $100 because like it's really valuable and they're business people who will throw $100 at it. And so I think just trying to sort of gauge that can be a really valuable thing, because there are a lot of people who also do really low volume, really high cost, and they're just providing something valuable to people who have the resources, and they do really well with it. And so if that's your audience, then like that's probably the way you should approach it, not $2 shout outs, because you're like big bougie businessmen aren't going to care about their shout out.
I think it's interesting too, hearing your story. It's like, it seems almost insurmountable, or maybe not insurmountable, but it seems like it's a long way off to build up to it. But I think it's you, Ian, you've been commenting that you have a Patreon account as well, and you're getting like $100 a month or something like that. Is that right?
Yeah, we have, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, I had it on mute. Yeah, we have about 1,000 listeners for our niche BC politics podcast, and we actually have 25 patrons, and we're getting $88 US a month after fees and everything, which is pretty fantastic. And I found it's been quite a drag to really get people to interact with our Patreon. Mm-hmm. I find we have like a very core listener base who listens to every show, even when it's kind of mediocrely produced, which it initially was, but they just love that it was there. And that's sort of what they jumped in for, just to say, hey, we love what you're doing. We want to make sure you can do it more. What was best is we had one person who came forward, and she's got some university backing. And so she wanted to make it more of a business expense. And so we invoiced her for a year, and we couldn't really add her straight to Patreon, but we could give her the RSS link that Patreon gives us to let her subscribe to any bonus stuff we could. But she managed to cut us a check or I guess a PayPal transfer for $600 straight up front. And that let us buy a bunch of audio gear, which jumped our recording quality 6 notches from, the one mic in the middle of the room to having some actual technical stuff that my cat's now getting stuck on.
Well, and I think that's really smart though, is like one of the nice things about say Patreon or whatever else is like, even if it starts off as not a big thing, you can almost treat it as like, well, I wasn't making anything before, and now I can just take this little bit and put it back into like, whether it's gear or whether it's marketing or whether it's whatever it is, but then you can start to expand it. And then as you expand your main audience, then hopefully it grows as well. And so now you start building your pool of, resources to help get critical mass and momentum behind this thing. And then once you have momentum, that's when you can start like pulling money for yourself if you want. But a lot of the times initially it's just having that like seed money to put back into what you're doing and grow it, whatever little costs you may have associated. And I think that can be really beneficial, so that it doesn't feel like you're making a ton of money, but it's at least not sucking you dry. Like even if you get a small Patreon and like that allows you to just like pay someone to edit your show, and it like steps your show production up a ton for your first like 10 patrons or whatever, like that can be really helpful to your listeners and increasing your listenership. And then like once you get an editor, then you like start to do some Instagram or Facebook ads or whatever else, and like now it's big, and now you get more money, and now you can do whatever you want. But I think that that's a key thing, is like getting access to resources can definitely help you scale up the show faster than it would if you were just like waiting until we have 1 million listeners and then we're going to cash out and I'm just going to fund it all off my own money in the meantime.
Yeah, one of the things we did when we were setting it up is you talked a lot about the rewards, and we set up reward categories like that, and it's really complicated, or it's really tough, I think, to come up with them right off the bat, but we managed to come up with unique names for it that relate to the sort of, because we're a politics podcast, we did like backbencher, parliamentary secretary, minister, etc., to be kind of cute like that. But the other thing that I think was neat about Patreon, and that I've read a lot about, what's really good to do, is setting up good goals. And so we set up very small goals initially, like $25 a month, $75 a month, and then we're aiming for our next 150. And the first 2 was just like something that, hey, if we could reach this, that would be great. And they're totally arbitrary, but by setting them low enough, we were able to encourage a few more people to hopefully get on board, because, we just need that one more $5 a month to get to 25. And I set those two initial goals at the first one, we'd advertise an episode a month. And the second one, we'd advertise all of our episodes because we're weekly. And that does use up most of that money, but it means the show gets out there to more people.
Yeah. I think that's like, even like you say, if it's $25 a month, it almost doesn't feel like anything. But yeah, if you can use that, you then have a small advertising budget that you didn't have before. And it's not like, it's something. So I think the small wins, and you can probably see it, like there are milestones like that. Like, oh, if I'm making $100 a month, I can put $25 behind each show or whatever. If I'm making $500 a month, I could, hire an editor, or maybe less than that, depending on how much you're like paying your editor and whatever, and all this other stuff. That like, each one of those things helps the show grow and makes it your life easier, which makes you want to keep doing it and have more fun with it. So I think really with like anything, there's a use for kind of a natural use for a lot of kind of budget ranges that you might come into with a Patreon account.
Yeah. And the goal thing that Ian's talking about there is that you can actually set, like, along your rewards, they have these things called goals, and you can be like, okay, I'm going to say $100 a month, and then you can like make a caption for it. And so you can say like, once we get $100 a month, we're going to do whatever, whatever it may be. And all your people who come to your Patreon can see the goal and can like see the progress bar. And so it's sort of a thing that you can have on your page to show like, hey, this is something we're trying to accomplish. And then it allows people to sort of feel like they're helping make progress. And Jeremy is distracting everyone with his messages.
Well, John was private messaging me that he was leaving, and then I mistakenly messaged everyone. Did anybody else have any questions for Evan?
I refuse to believe you all. You're all liars.
Nobody? No questions? All right.
Nobody at all.
That's cool. That was lots of great stuff.
Yeah, hopefully it was helpful. If you guys do have any questions, feel free to hit me up. I can post my stuff on the Facebook group or something, but you can find me on Facebook or drop me an email or hit me up on Instagram or whatever else. But more than willing to do whatever I can and just sort of share some of that stuff. And I do have like, I don't know if any of it would be helpful for people too, but like Patreon gives you a lot of analytics on all your stuff. And so I guess there's some stuff in there that's sort of interesting that like, it looks like I launched it August of last year. And month one was $230. So we started off with something, which was good, but we basically stayed sub $1,000 until March of 2017. And then between March and May, it jumped from 976 to 1870. Wow. I'm not exactly sure what I did then, but apparently I got a bunch of people to jump on. And then we sort of slowly crept up, but not really made a whole bunch of headway because May of this year was 1870 and October of this year is 2273. Yeah, and Patreon, it looks like, takes 5%. Processing fees are just under 5%. So basically you lose about 10% off the top. Looks like I've taken just north of 90%. In general. And yeah, I don't know if there's anything else in there, but if there's any like numbers or any of that kind of stuff that people would be interested in, I'm more than happy to share all of that stuff too. The one other thing that I'm curious, it's interesting when people leave, they do like an exit survey. And so you can actually see why people are leaving. And usually most of them are either my financial situation changed or I only intended to pledge for a limited time. But like September was one of the months that I was just like traveling constantly. And I lost 3 people in like 3 days who all said the creator wasn't engaging like I expected. And that like put a knife in my heart. But I was trying to see if I could guesstimate how many people I've lost based on this exit survey. They don't really make it clear.
I did have 1 or 2 other questions. Are you pulling out? So with Patreon for me, I pull out through PayPal and that takes, I think, 2 or 3% or something, but there's also the Payoneer or something. And I think that ends up taking less if you have a lot more money. Have you experimented with that or are you just using PayPal?
I am using PayPal. And basically I think if I remember correctly, the way it works is that PayPal charges you Let me look. PayPal charges you like a certain percent, but it caps at like $20 or something. And then the other option for me is Stripe. And so Stripe does a direct deposit to my bank account. And I think it's 25 cents is the cap. So I do think it's less. I haven't bothered going to Stripe. I probably should, the more that I think about it. But I haven't bothered mainly because it's really convenient to like get this infusion of money into my PayPal account and then like leave it there and not touch it, which is sort of nice. And I like buy gear on eBay and off Facebook groups and stuff and like swap stuff around. So it's just convenient to have it in PayPal too. But I probably am losing whatever, like $100 a year off it or something.
My other one was, do you offer your supporters any one-time donation opportunities, like just direct through PayPal?
I have a link in my like Patreon bio that's like, if you want to support but don't want to pledge, here's my PayPal donate link or whatever. I think I've only ever had like 2 people use it though. For the most part, they'd rather just like pledge $1 for a month and then bail or, you know, whatever else than do that. Let me see payout preferences. Yeah, so it looks like direct deposit via Stripe, 25-cent fee. PayPal transfer fees are 1% of the amount transferred, capped at $20 per deposit. So I'm going to switch it to Stripe. The other thing, what was the other thing I was just thinking? Oh, the other thing that is cool about Patreon is I feel like they're doing more stuff to make the actual like engagement, content creation, and connection as creators easier. And so like one of the things that they added recently is they added like native live stream support. And so they're testing that right now so that you can like live stream direct to your patrons using like crowdcasts and stuff. And then I think they announced that they're beta testing like an app, and that it will sort of be like, my understanding of it is that it's sort of like Instagram stories, but only accessible by your patrons and stuff. So they're like creating ways for you to like quickly and easily make stuff that people can engage with, which is cool. And then they're also doing some stuff that they've sort of been teasing and playing with, that like they're going to start collecting like merch sizing from people and then like partner with custom ink or something to allow you to like deliver physical merch to patrons and stuff. But like I think for them to maintain all of the back end of it, which would be really nice. So there's some stuff like that that's really cool. And that's one thing like I decided to do this month, because part of like all the analytics you can do is you can see like the pledge someone's at, and you can sort everyone by like lifetime donations. So you can see how much everyone's given you ever. And I took the top 5 lifetime donors that I have, and I messaged them all, and I'm just making them special shirts and sending them all these like 5 shirts. And it's sort of like a tongue-in-cheek thing where they're like jerseys and they say super secret supporter, and then they're numbered based on their order on the back of them. But like they dig it. And they're like, I think for me to get the 5 shirts made, it's like $150, but like everyone will feel cool about it because like it's a thing that happened, and it's just like a general, you know, keeps the hype moving. And so it's one of those things that like finding little ways that you can help feed back into supporting people. And I'm like, okay, if this person's given me like $300 over the last year, you know, I can afford to get them a $20 t-shirt.
Well, and especially like you probably don't even need to ask, but they might post that in the group then, and everybody else gets to see like, oh, that's cool, these guys all got shirts made.
Right.
And
yeah, so doing stuff like
that
helps feed into all of that. Definitely just keeps moving, keeps marketing, keeps all that stuff going on, and hopefully keeps people coming back.
Cool. Anybody else got anything else for Evan? No? This has been awesome. This is like the original recording was good, but this is way better. And I know
Definitely
Ian had some questions, and Tom had some questions that I would not have thought of, which is why, oh, and Gemma had questions too. That's right. We did have some questions.
Jeremy, always forgetting people.
And distracting people with my texts that are supposed to be to individual people that go to the group and take away from the conversation. Now Evan's following my lead. Literally the worst.
Literally the worst.
Thanks for your time, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, dude. Thanks for listening. See you guys next time. Check out my podcast if you want. It might bore you, but you might find it interesting.
I feel I've listened to a couple episodes and I'm not like a film guy. Like I like photography and creative stuff and I enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Even not, I can't remember which episodes I listened to. Definitely Star Wars. I can't remember the guy's name, but I'm a huge Star Wars fan. So
Greg or Bradford Young, they both did Star Wars stuff.
Yeah.
But it's not a super like technical show. It's a lot more like life and interpersonal stuff and whatever. Like we get technical sometimes, but I don't really care about technical stuff that much.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Cool. Thanks, guys. I'll see you all next time. We can do this again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Boy.